Greetings, I'm Alfred Leverott Weber, and it's a great privilege coming to us from Australia, author Paul Anthony Wallis, with our with our conference hosts, Stephen and Evan Strong. And this is another in the series of our alien ancestry. So we're all looking forward. We're now live on Exopolitics TV, and we're all looking forward to learning more. There are links here where you go, and Stephen and Evan can tell you more about, and when we distribute this to you, there'll be links where you can sign up for this very interesting conference. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Alfred. Look, what we're doing is we're putting up a conference. When is it? This weekend? Evan?
This weekend. So if you're in Australia or down under, it's on the Sunday. But if you're in Canada, America, those kind of places, it would be your Saturday, probably in the afternoon/evening for North America and Canada. Unfortunately, if you're listening in Britain, it's probably in the middle of the night.
1 o'clock in the morning. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, this can be watched over a month. So don't panic if you can't see it then. You've got a month to have a look at it. Now, this particular presentation, from my point of view, is one of the most important ones we've done. We've done how many now, Evan? 23?
This will be the 23rd.
23rd. It'll be one of the most important ones because what it's doing to an extent is tying together a lot of the work we've done over this whole series of presentations. And in that respect, that's why we waited until we got to this stage to ask Paul to speak with us. And we're looking at this overview of the change that's taking place on our planet. We've mentioned that many times, and it's in our articles. And more importantly, the involvement that extraterrestrials have had throughout our history in the past and in the future. And in that respect, what I'd like to do is I'm going to throw over to Paul in a sec, who's got a series of books that I think, when the change comes, if I have any say, because I used to be a high school teacher, a primary school teacher, and a principal, I would make his books obligatory reading for every student on this planet, because it goes back into a very important stories that are found in the Bible, but Paul's managed to find the real truths. And what I'm going to ask him to do for the first half of this session is primarily give an overview of your books, Paul, and the underlying truths and the fact that our gods, and by the way, we both believe in Jesus and we both believe in a creator, but when it comes down to the archangels, I've got a strong suspicion they're nearly all aliens, and I think Paul's on the same page as that. Not all of them, but some of them certainly are, and they've had a massive influence in our evolution, in our philosophy, and in our wisdom, and in our future. So what I'd like to do first is go across to Paul. And Paul, if you could give us a very brief, possibly about half an hour, something like that, overview, which I know is nearly impossible because you've written 3 books, on the Eden series. So could we go over to you, Paul?
Absolutely. Well, at the weekend, I'm going to be focusing on where I've reached in the 3rd in the Eden series, which is Echoes of Eden. And Echoes of Eden asked the question, what secrets of human potential were buried with our ancestors' memories of ET contact? And so I'll let you know how I got to that question, how I got to that territory, what the route was, and how that reflects in the whole series. And the series of books begins with Escaping from Eden, then moves on to The Scars of Eden, and now we're launching Echoes of Eden. What happened prior to these 3 books? People knew me for writing books of spirituality and church history and hagiographies. And I was living my life in the sedate world of Christian ministry, church-based ministry. I was a theological educator, worked as a church doctor, an archdeacon for the Anglican Church in Australia. And it was in that role of a theological educator, training pastors in hermeneutics, and that's the principles of interpreting ancient texts, that I started to notice the white rabbits that have led me onto this territory. And it's really been a route paved for me by Bible translation. So the story that led to Escaping from Eden began when I was gifted with some time. And in Escaping from Eden, I talk about an ultimate Frisbee injury laying me off, and then I have some time for some research. And just between us, don't tell anybody, I really was injured in an ultimate Frisbee match, but I kind of use that as a metaphor for all the time that the universe has given me at different times to drill down into anomalies that were catching my attention in the Bible or in the stories we tell from out of the Bible. And I preached one time, many times I preached through the book of Genesis. But a few years ago, I preached through that book once again, and all the little glitches in the story, the little details that don't quite tie together, don't quite make sense, don't quite fit in the neat and tidy story of Almighty God creates the universe from nothing, creates the planet, and ultimately creates you and me. These anomalies were catching my attention, and I knew I had to return and do some work to find out why they were anomalies, why they were glitches. And I approached it with the tools that I'd been training pastors in. So source analysis, where you go to a text and you ask, where did this come from? Is this the original telling of the story? And if it isn't, how does it differ from the original telling? And what does that then tell us about the agenda of the writer? Form analysis, where you ask, what kind of literature is this? Is this history? Is it apocalyptic literature where someone has seen something, they didn't understand it, and they've just written it down for the reader to then interpret? Is it poetry? Is it prophecy? Is it propaganda? Is it history with interpretation? And then the fundamental tool always in hermeneutics is to ask, what do the words mean? And it was simply applying those tools to these anomalous moments in the stories of the Bible that opened up a whole new world to me. And just to give a hint of the kind of anomalies I'm talking about from the very first sentence of the Bible, when God starts referring to himself in the plural. Why is the word translated as God a plural word that takes plural attributives and plural verb forms? And I'm talking about the word Elohim. And then if Elohim means God, how come the Elohim get into fights with each other? And how come they conflict over agendas for Project Humanity? How come thousands of humans are slaughtered in the conflicts of the Elohim? Might Elohim actually refer to a plurality of beings? And of course, a child with a child's Bible will pick up on this. A child will ask, why does God say, let us make humans to look like one of us? Or the snake shows up from out of nowhere. Who and what is the snake? Because at the beginning of the story, he's not a snake. He's got arms and legs and he can speak human. And he's clearly quite a powerful player, powerful enough that he can alter what human beings are. So there's a big mystery there. And then, of course, a child will say, how does a God of love genocide everybody in Genesis 6, so on and so forth? You get to Genesis 11, and a flourishing technological human society is bombed back into a pre-technological state because they've breached building codes. Really? We've built taller buildings since. What was the real issue? And so I began to realize that these kinds of questions really boil down to questions of translation. What do the words mean? And so Elohim was one of the words, really the key one, but there are some others as well I might come back to a little later. And so I decided the best way to peel back layers of traditional interpretation, assumption that we layer over the top of the text, is to go to the root meanings of the words. And the moment I did that, the stories began to resolve and make sense. It became clearer that we are looking at a world where our ancestors are bumping up against a plurality of advanced beings who are governing over us and conflicting over Project Earth and Project Humanity. And in Escaping from Eden, I take the reader through the process of rereading the stories of beginnings of the Bible with these key words plainly in view, with their root meanings plainly in view. And the story shifts, but not in a random way. The stories shift and suddenly line up with what in source analysis we understand to be the source texts. And that's the cuneiform texts from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, Syria. And the stories of the Elohim turn out to be the Bible's summary form of the stories of the sky people in the Mesopotamian stories. Now, the moment I saw that, it was like taking the red pill. When Neo takes the red pill in the Matrix, suddenly the whole universe changes and he can't go back to the universe as it was before because he knows it's a fiction. That's really what it was like for me. The moment I did the translation work and realized that's the relationship. The Bible is the summary form of the Mesopotamian stories, and the stories we've told as God's stories are a spin on stories of sky people. And in the 21st century, we have another word for sky people, and it's extraterrestrials, or we might sometimes say aliens. But I prefer extraterrestrials because the sky people were people, and they behave like people, and many times they look like people. Whereas you say aliens, and immediately you're thinking of something that might look very, very different to us. But a lot of the stories talk about sky people who look similar to us. They may be larger, they may be cleverer, they may have higher tech. But then as you go further into the biblical text, you realize, no, there's a great diversity of entities here. Not just us, not just smarter versions of us from another planet, but very different kinds of entity who are all sitting in what the Bible calls a sky council. There's some kind of arrangement that has been come to by multiple ET visitors and would-be colonizers who are bumping up against each other over questions of how many humans should there be on planet Earth? How long should they live, therefore? What access should they have to medication? What access should they have to us? What access should they have to information? And the push-pull of all those discussions mirrors geopolitics today in a rather uncanny way. So that's where I began in Escaping from Eden, doing the translation work, realizing that the stories of the Bible present a cosmos that's full of life, some of which has come here and occupied planet Earth, colonized the planet, governed over our ancestors. And many of the stories of beginnings, as we read them, are really the memories of traumatic times in our journey in company with our wider cosmic family. I say traumatic times, but it's not all dark. And once again, if I say alien today, people's minds go to Mars attacks, invasion of the body snatchers, Independence Day. And I was quite reassured when I looked at the story of first contact that you find in the Bible. It's a story of benevolent contact. It's a story of advanced beings arriving from somewhere else in the cosmos to help the planet in a moment post-cataclysm and help life on Earth reestablish itself. And in the Bible, one of the clues that that's the case is that before any word of creation is spoken in Genesis 1, planet Earth already exists, flooded, shrouded in darkness, in a state of devastation, if you follow the Hebrew words. Well, how does that work? Before the first word of creation, before let there be light, before the sun, moon, and stars, planet Earth is already there, flooded, shrouded in darkness. And as I reread the story with the root meanings in view, it became clear that what we're actually presented with is not a story of creation, but a story of recovery. And as I went on a tour of ancestral narratives around the world, I discovered that many of our creation stories are actually stories of recovery, and they are told from the perspective of ancestral eyewitnesses who were describing the process of rehabilitation that is embarked on by these visitors. So another key word in the Bible is the word ruach, which gets translated as spirit, and is understood to mean spirit of God. But the root meaning is a thing that creates a strong wind or a blast of wind. And the word still exists in Amharic, roha. It means the same thing. It can mean a fan, something that creates a breeze. And sure enough, that's what it does. It arrives, it hovers over the water, and the Hebrew word is metahephet, hovers hawk-like over the waters, and then it's the wind that it creates that separates the waters, step one of rehabilitation, separating salt water from fresh water, polluted water from clean water, land from water, and the terraforming goes on. In my tour around the world, what struck me is that that visual memory is carried by cultures all around the world. So you go to the Philippines, and they have the story of, you know how I said the ruach hovers hawk-like? Go to the Philippines, they'll say the hawk hovered over the water and used its wings to create vortices of wind to clear the land, drive the water away from the higher ground and dry the land so that it was rehabilitated for life, for cultivation, so on and so forth. Go to the Sumerian narratives, you've got the four winds that come in and separate the waters. And so the work of rehabilitation begins. It's there in narratives all around the world. And as I saw these correlations, I began to ask different questions of world mythology and ancestral narrative. My prejudice was to see these ancient stories as fable, moral tales. Well, you try and get morals out of some of these ancient stories, and it's very odd morals you're going to end up with. You can read them, if you want to, in a fundamentalistic way, as if every word, every metaphor you take literally. It's like a diary entry of what happened. But I started asking a different question, which is, what is the memory? What happened? What is the memory that's being carried by this story, by these metaphors? And I found it was the same visual memory of recovery and rehabilitation, and of visitors working with our ancestors to teach us how to live on the planet in a balanced and sustainable way. And then later interventions showing us how to move beyond subsistence living to the cultivation of crops, to farming, to specialized society, to building cities and civilizations. And as I make that journey in Escaping from Eden, I find correlations in other disciplines of study, other scientific disciplines that would line up with this way of seeing things. So we go to the scientists who have been studying the Younger Dryas Cold period, and people like Richard Firestone, who have demonstrated the connection between that, a cometary impact, and the extinction of prior civilizations that were here on planet Earth. An explanation as to why the Clovis culture disappeared 10,000 years ago. And with that civilization, 75% of the megafauna on North America. And we have an explanation as to why we can find the remains of megalithic cultures that would have been above sea level no more recently than 12,000 years ago. And we're beginning to look at that period, the Younger Dryas Cold period, the major flood events at the beginning and end of that. It ties in with the work of the University of Az in Norway, the Max Planck Institute, which in 1998 sent a team into the top of the Fertile Crescent into southeast Turkey, where they discovered what appears to be the first farm, the beginning of our story, of our civilization, the place where humanity learned how to adapt naturally occurring plants to turn them into cultivatable crops. This is at Karakadag. and coincidentally in the same moment work out how to do animal husbandry. An incredible leap forward in an incredibly localized place, and then suddenly it springs up all around the world. And this is very exciting because Manfred Hoyne, who led that team, says we pinpointed the beginning of our civilization. Well, yes, we may have done that, but how is it that you can go, 800 miles down the road and find Göbekli Tepe, which is the tail end of a megalithic culture predating the first farm. And so we've got a moment of pivot between a previous culture, previous civilization that we don't know anything about, and then the beginning of our civilization. Another place I go in terms of other disciplines in Escaping from Eden is to the world of neuroscience, because the ancestral narratives that carry the story of our being adapted, visited, re-engineered by cosmic neighbors, those narratives all speak of a time when our ancestors had higher cognitive powers than we do. They talk about a long process of experimentation to produce Homo sapiens as we know ourselves to be. And the story always takes the same shape, whether you're listening to it from the Efik people in Nigeria, or the Mayan culture in Mesoamerica, or the Sumerian story, the biblical story, the Greek narratives. It's always the same shape, that we're being upgraded, and then, oh, whoa, we can't manage these people, they're too advanced. And we're knocked down a peg or two to the point where we can be more easily managed, knocked down from a point where we have higher cognitive abilities to the place where we're limited to our 5 physical senses. And for any information beyond that, we have to rely on an authority to tell us what's what. And those governing us and engineering us felt that was what they could work with. And seeing this shape repeating around the world caught my attention. And at the end of Escaping from Eden, I realized that when our story of origins changes, our understanding of who we are and what we are capable changes. What we're capable of changes. It becomes a story about human potential. So at the end of Escaping from Eden, I knew I had to go back and ask the question, well, what are we capable of if that's our story of beginnings? Rather than the conventional evolutionary story that says, we've evolved to this point, and that's your lot. What you see is what you get. We're capable of no more. This is our level, which is the same message as you get from a lot of religious story. God made us this intelligent, and it's really wrong to try and obtain information that you're not supposed to have, or switch on higher faculties through all sorts of protocols. That's really out of bounds. Well, why is that? The story that emerges from paleo contact is different and says we are capable of greater things, and our ancestors had higher faculties, and there are ways of accessing them and switching them back on. So I knew I had to return to that, which I do in Echoes of Eden. In the book in between, The Scars of Eden, I asked the question, what difference does it make? What difference does it make if we were created by God or adapted or modified or engineered by cosmic neighbors? And partly it has to do with our potential and what we think is possible for us. And partly it has to do with recovering from some of the aftermath of being governed by non-human entities. Now, many cultures around the world carry stories that say that was quite a painful experience at different times. The Bible says it was painful for us because it resulted in patterns of war and patterns of leadership that were really damaging to human welfare. And I think there are scars in our psyche as a species that date from a time when we were managed by entities that had no fellow feeling with us, no empathy with us. And the Scars of Eden looks at what that looked like and how we might reimagine ourselves once we realize that our stories of beginnings are different to what we were taught in school. By the time I was at the end of The Scars of Eden, I realized that this narrative of paleo contact, visitation, colonization, adaptation by ET neighbors is almost universal. And that if you listen to the folklore, to the indigenous narratives of cultures all around the world, they will tell that story. And they will also say that the ET presence has remained with us constantly. And they also say that you will never have a full understanding of why things work today in the way they do until you realize there's a non-human layer to the governance of humanity. I saw that all around the world through the history of empire, invasion, colonization, the narratives that carry the memory of ET contact are always suppressed. And they're often suppressed very, very violently. You go into a country, you burn the books, you slaughter the priests, so that the information that that culture was carrying hopefully gets obliterated and replaced by you, the imperial conquerors. Now you are the ministers of truth. Now you plant your churches that tell everybody what's what and what to believe. You are the news agency that says what did and did not happen. And you extinguish the story, you extinguish the other authorities so that you can have full spectrum dominance. And the more I read of these stories, the more I realized that what was being suppressed was not so much the memory of ET contact in the past. What was being suppressed was our understanding of ourselves and what we're capable of. And that what was being suppressed was the empowerment of the grassroots that comes from the indigenous stories. And when I say empowerment, I mean what we think we're capable of as a society, but also in terms of our higher cognitive abilities. And I began to join the dots around the world and see why it was that conquering powers did their level best to prevent initiation culture from persisting, because it's through initiation that indigenous cultures pass on not only the ancient information that they're curating as a people, but the higher cognitive skills and abilities, the shamanic protocols, the contact protocols that they've maintained in that culture. When I say contact, I do mean contact with other kinds of entity, contact with other flesh and blood entities, contact with transdimensional entities, contact with energy-based beings, all the plethora of beings that we see represented in the Sky Council stories of the deep past have a part to play in how we occupy the cosmos and occupy our planet. And if you go to a shamanic leader for healing, or because you're looking for deep insight, you'll find that a lot of what they do is contact protocols. And I was very intrigued to find that in my research for Echoes of Eden, and to realize that that is not exclusive to the world of indigenous initiation, that if you go into the world of intelligence in the modern world, in the court of Queen Elizabeth I, in 5 successive presidential administrations in the USA, you will find that there are departments working on higher human technologies that are really a revisiting of these ancient shamanic indigenous approaches to contact. And that's what I explore in Echoes of Eden, because I think if we want to know how to live more intelligently on the planet, and if we want to switch on higher faculties, it is the elders of our traditional cultures, it is initiation culture that we need to return to. We need to sit at the feet of the elders of our traditional peoples and ask for the information that the powers have tried to extinguish over generations. And that's the place we get to in Echoes of Eden. That's the journey I hope I lead the reader on, not to provide all the answers, but to say this is where we need to look. These are the people we need to be listening to for all our sakes, as we consider the question of how we live fruitfully and sustainably on planet Earth. So that's my summary.
summary.
Sorry, I was just unmuting you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, Paul. That's a very succinct summary of one part of this story, and you'll now see why we wanted Paul involved right now. Because what we're going to do is Paul is examining all the scriptures and all the records that have been put down on paper. And we want to go back further to that time, Paul, when we were at the zenith, at the peak before the trough. And what you're doing is you're covering that part that happens after Göbekli Tepe and that, and when we fall back down. What I'm going to look at now, and you'll see why I wanted Paul to be part of this, is I want to go back to we did the paper. Now we need to do the rocks. Now the rocks, you go back further around the world to the engravings that took place in different places all over the world and the paintings that were put on the rocks. The one advantage with rocks when it comes to recording information, ladies and gentlemen, is paper can be burnt and paper can be rewritten on and it can be edited. But with a rock, if you try and re-edit that, it's a bit tricky because it's all there, isn't it?
You can, but then you see that it's been changed.
Yes, you see it straight away. And it's clever because recently when we change it, we make sure, as you said, they destroy the priests, they destroy the paper, and they put in new paper. We want to go back to a time when, and I'm going to look at that word civilization first. I'm going to look at what I think is Australia's, well, I think, Paul, you are Australia's modern day counterpart to Frederick Slater. And I want to talk about Frederick first, just in a little bit of detail, because I can tell you in the Standing Stone site, we have his interpretations that speaks about man coming to earth, doesn't he?
Yep.
With 7 senses fully developed, which backs up exactly what you said. We're interested in that time, and we've got someone who's done Paul's work in the 1930s called Frederick Slater. Now, it's interesting because I've got to tell you that no one knew a thing about him for 80 years. And then we stumbled upon, through another gentleman called Richard Patterson, 18 letters he wrote. And what he spoke about there was, and Evan, if you can just read a few things, and he was basically giving an interpretation of what was written on the rocks at the Standing Stone side. And what Evan's going to read out now is a selection of the words of Slater. Then I want to talk about whether this gentleman, who, by the way, mainstream claim is not an academic, he's not a scholar, he wasn't known of, and he amounts to nothing, and he's probably mad. That is the present day interpretation of this man.
You can go to Wikipedia and it'll say pretty much that.
And more.
We know how great Wikipedia is anyway. The breath of God is the divine light of the soul. The light of truth flows like a river of fire from God to the soul of man and women united. God came in with the light from darkness and gave man a soul, and the sons of man brought in with the light became the pillars of heaven. He who brought life into the world set down man and women and gave them the sacred means of propagating life. Truth brought out on wings to earth from God to man. The divine light of God gives the soul and the fire which brought life from afar.
Now, Evan can read this for the next half hour, and this was written in the 1940s, wasn't it, Evan? 41, 38, 39, around that period.
Yeah, the late 30s, and then pretty much by the end of...
Now, I'm going to tell you something now. No historian and archaeologist is writing stuff like that, saying this is what's at an Aboriginal site. Now, Slater, very quickly, I want to thank Eric Bauer and John White, who did a massive amount of research to find literally dozens upon dozens upon dozens of microfiche copies of Slater's name in all the newspapers in Australia. Now, why was he that well known? Let me explain very briefly who this man is, because you've got to understand who the man is if you're going to believe this stuff. Number one, he was the editor from 1894 through to about 1938. He was the editor of 4 newspapers. He was a journalist. He became such a good editor when he went to Newcastle, which is the second largest city in New South Wales. He took a paper and doubled its readership in 2 years, and then was given the job as a chief journalist in the Sydney Sun. He worked for the Herald. He basically wrote for every newspaper in the east coast of Australia. We have a quote that he was a well-known journalist and another quote that says he was an expert in Aboriginal writing. He wrote comedic operas, didn't he, Evan?
Poems.
Poems were published. He also wrote quite a few fictional books. And then he wrote a book called Scribes of the Stone Age, which is the book we thought was destroyed. Now, it was accepted for publication in 1939 in London. The manuscript was sent there and the publishing house was blown up, and we thought we'd lost him completely.
Yeah, it was lost in one of the German bombings in London in World War II.
And burnt. But fortunately, we got his manuscript with all the crossed out bits, all of it.
It looks like it's his last draft.
His last draft. Sometimes he scribbled over bits and put lines through there. It's his final draft. And what we're going to do is we're going to assure you that this gentleman was considered, of those articles, and we've written them on the front page, they've been in the second page in every paper, there is not one critique, not one person has challenged his work. And there's a story of him going to a place called Maruta, and it had been 25 years the archaeologists had been there, and no one could read it.
Yeah.
And what happened?
He marched in there within 20 minutes or 22 minutes, I think it was. He had
interpreted the whole rock platform, and no one disagreed with it.
They all kind of went, "Oh my God, that's it."
That's it.
And then basically he turned off and walked away. The sunset.
Yeah, and said, "Right, done that." And what? This is the point. This is the important part. How could he do it? This is where what he calls the great record was found. A lady called Eliza Dunlop. In the 1830s, we've only been in Australia, the white fellas have only been there for about 30, 40 years, and they were in the Wallamai. In fact, they were the first people living there.
She was the wife of the first magistrate.
Who was good to Aboriginal people, but they loved her. She actually interpreted their poems. She went to court when the Miles Creek massacre and led a protest about all of the people that being released, and then wrote letters to England, and then they retried them and hung them. She was responsible for that. She interpreted their work, and even in Wikipedia, she is called the interpreter of Aboriginal writings. She'd sat down with the chief there, and he gave her a complete compendium of the first language. And Slater worked with a guy called Goddard, who was the great-grandson of Eliza Hamilton Dunlop, and he got a hold of the great records, and then that was what he used to interpret.
It's like a manual.
It's a manual. Now, what we're going to do now is we're going to take you through the first chapter, because we've got the lot. And I'm writing a book on the first 4 chapters, and I've nearly finished it. And Evan's going to read a section of writings from there, so now you can judge. Okay, you've heard his credentials. He is a scholar. You can't be an editor of all these newspapers and be an idiot.
And turn around and do poetry and turn around and do comedic operas. Like he was a jack of all trades.
A jack of all trades, but a master of one, because he was called the expert on Aboriginal writings. So what Evan's going to read now is he's going to read a commentary about the word that Paul used a lot. The word was civilization. But in the 1930s, Slater did not see civilization as that massive Empire State Building and the cars that have smoke that comes out the back and this newfangled thing called a radio. That is not how he saw civilization. He saw the whole thing from a different perspective. If you could, please, Evan.
Man in the beginning of time had a higher sense of his duty to man and the development of life, which to him was the soul, then can be found in the cultured nations of 2,000 years ago or the nations of today.
That is a radical beginning to this book. We all think civilization is guns and weaponry and chemistry and all that sort of stuff. He claims civilization, as you heard earlier, is all about culturing the soul. And he says the people of the ancient past, particularly the original people, who were considered the most primitive, inverted commas, of all the indigenous people on the planet, because they didn't invent the bow and arrow, which, by the way, they did have one, but that doesn't matter. He then said, no, that's not it. Change your parameters. Now, next up, he goes even more down this sensational path by making another claim, and they're all in the introductory chapter, And that's this one that Evan's going to read.
The records of the Stone Age Australians, the remnants of which still survive, are the same as those of other Stone Age men. Records that have been the despair of anthropologists and archaeologists. All know that they are records, but the method of deciphering they have failed to discover. They are lost in the multiplicity of languages and the cultures of races that have come after them. The key will be found in these pages.
And that's where I want to stop. Because in this book of about 700 pages, he's saying the key to reading all, this is where it gets quite interesting, all of the Stone Age records, not just at Maruta, but in Turkey, in Iran, in Iraq, anywhere on this planet. If you can go to an ancient stone engraving or painting, he believes there was, and by the way, when we say this, don't forget, even the Bible admits there was a time when we had one language. That is the time when we're at the peak, because we can all talk to each other and we can trust each other. When we can't understand each other, mistrust festers. What he's saying is the key will be found in these pages. Now, I want to make a point here before we go any further. If I was a publisher and I read those comments in the first 5 pages, I think, hello, hang on for a sec, boys and girls. Let's stop here.
Something's going on.
Something's going on here. I want proof. I'm not publishing this because this is against everything we've heard.
Mhm.
I want real substantial proof that what you're saying to me is correct. And can I make the point? They agreed to that to be published, and we know that because it was written in page 3 of the Adelaide paper, wasn't it?
Mhm.
And they said it's being published, and it's called, what's the language called? Murray Walda. Murray Walda. That is the first language. Now, let's go a bit further. The first chapter is called The Pharaohs of the Southland. And that does certainly have an Egyptian ring about it, doesn't it? Because he believes, by the way, and it's in here, he believes the Egyptians came here to learn their culture. But here, let's just read that little section there about what that actually means.
The Pharaohs of the Southland is not a poetic nimbus set round the head of kings of most ancient renown. It is used in the more primordial sense. It denotes the royal estates when the world was a great house and mankind emerged from the gateway of the Neolithic region in the dawn of time. To the southern part of the domain came a grand pageant on the rocks, as though on the leaves of a book.
On the leaves of a book, you're supposed to
there we go.
turn the page, and I'm sorry, he needs help.
It's quite
Okay.
smudged. This is what happens when you
Get a
to
copy.
ink after what? How many years has it been?
85 years.
85 years.
It
Yeah.
runs.
Primordial man wrote the story of creation and the destiny of man.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, here's the next claim he's made, that these ancient beings, just like Paul was saying before, I've got a record of our creation and the destiny of man. Now, I've got to tell you, if I'm going to read a book and it tells me about our creation and our destiny, I want to read that book. I would think that's a book worth looking at. That's a book that I really feel is an important part of this story. So now what we're finding is that we've got this base. Now, next up, he makes another fantastic claim that you'd want evidence for. Could we just look at that one, please, Evan?
Their simple faith, they knew the light of heaven as the soul of the earth, was the foundation of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the philosophy of Confucius of China, and the religion of the Arcadians.
And he'll go further and tell you it is the base, from the Australian original people, we have the base of our language, of our philosophy, of our numerology, of our religions. He's basically telling the world that it began here. And further on, of course, we're just taking bits and pieces we go. We know we're running out of time. Now, I want to pause for a sec now and then just have a look at this. I started to wonder, why did you get all this information? I mean, I'm not a black fella, is he? No, he's a white fella. He came from England. He's very well educated. We all know that. You can tell by his writing. And I wanted to find something in this opening chapter that gave me an indication of what this man was like. Why did he get the right to stumble on what could be the greatest? It makes the Rosetta Stone look like a paltry introduction to the main event. And then I stumbled upon this part here, and it showed me something about this gentleman that made me realize, yes, you are the one who needed to get this piece of information.
Still, the forest primeval, where rock carvings by Aborigines defy the wheels of time in more senses than one. For the wheels of the vehicles, ancient and modern, have desecrated their antique loveliness, beautified by age and the stories they tell. They are observed by passersby with comments of curiosity or derision.
What we started to work out as we went through this is this man had a real love of the culture. It wasn't just some sort of academic pursuit. It's idolized because he's done comedic operas and he's written fictional books and he writes for all the newspapers. It wasn't just something he did. This was a passion that overrode him. By the way, I want to tell you, the whole of his family thought he was a nutter. But what he's saying right now, man, in the 1930s, let's get real here. This is stuff he's saying. But it's interesting because Richard Slater, his son, I think it might have been, he said, oh, we don't believe anything he wrote at all. And then he said, but one thing he said was this, he knew an awful lot, they're the words he said, about Aboriginal culture, ceremonies and myths. And I'm thinking, hang on for a sec, the guy is writing about one thing. Yes. Aboriginal culture, ceremonies and myths. But we don't believe what he said, but he knows a lot about it. And I'm thinking the family have looked at their father or their grandfather and thought, oh God, how embarrassing is all this? We don't want to be part of this. So they've walked away. But I want to close with this opening paragraph, this opening chapter. I want to close with what I said earlier. Because the last thing he says in the first chapter, because the first 4 chapters, what they do is they set out the whole scope of what he's discovered. And what I'm doing is I'm taking those 4 chapters plus a paper he wrote, making some commentaries and putting that out as the first book. I'm going to make it as cheap as I can so that people can read it. There won't be pictures, there won't be photographs in it. I want to make it very cheap so people can read what he's got to say with some commentaries we'll put in there. But I want to finish with the end of this first chapter. He makes this commentary about Eliza Dunlop's book. And if you could, please, Evan.
It was not until the Great Record Book was discovered and the whole incident of the ritual revealed in their own language and translated into English that the full importance of the pictures and the rocks was revealed.
So, ladies and gentlemen, he finishes that first chapter, and what we are prepared to do, if people want, we are prepared to freely send out that first chapter to anyone that wants to read it. We've done this a lot. The first chapter is very important because if it whets the appetite and stimulates people to say, could this be true? Could what all this guy is saying be true? Now, I want to make one point. Forget what the critics have said about him being ignorant, stupid, and mad. He's none of those things. He's the opposite of everything they've said. What this is all about. It's basically what Paul is doing, but we've gone back to the time when we're at the peak. My elder that gave me ceremony spoke about the time when we had more DNA.
It was switched on. It's been DNA.
Yeah, like the 90% we say is just a spectator that comes to watch the football match and occasionally cheers you on, actually works. It's got a job. He was saying we come from that time. Now, Slater is translating from that time. Now, what we've got in that first paragraph, in that first chapter, is an introduction that's not like any introduction was written in any archaeological book before that or even till today. I mean, when I read this and said, hang on, I can translate everything in the world, I thought, whoa, hang on for a sec, where are we going here? But I've got to make one point, Alfred. I have snuck forward a bit. And I will tell you one part about the language. This language that's gone everywhere. And by the way, we've got proof. We've got stories from a guy called Herman Klatch who came here for 4 years as an archaeologist. And he was stunned He found that all the ancient Latin, all the ancient Greek, he could find every one of those words in Australian tribal groups. He found everything. In fact, he told us about the Lutherans in West Australia. And he said the Lutherans said they could talk to the original people there in German and they understood one another. And Platt said, how could that be? And they said, oh, this is obvious. They were at the Tower of Babel and they were the most depraved and they were sent the furthest to West Australia. But we can still understand them because we had that first language. No, you got to back the front. It came from here. So what we're looking at here is Slater is telling us that the Egyptians, the Confucius, all religions, they come from here. And then here's the clangor. He makes it very clear in the one paper, and we will be talking about it. He talks about the two creation sky heroes, which is the word we use too, by the way, Paul, and he knows. The two sky heroes were Biami, the male, and Mulla, the female. And in Slater's paper, he tells us Mulla was not born of the earth. She came from space, from the star, from up high. She was born from there. And after a while, she went back up there to reside where Biami lives also, and makes it very, very clear that Biami and Mulla are not gods. They are sky heroes. And of course, Biami, and what Biami means is to cut off one's leg to make humanity. That is genetic, straight out genetic metaphor. In fact, when you track Biami, and we've done this many times, you only have how many feet, Evan? One. It's the right foot. Biami does not have a left foot in his tracks because part of the narrative was he made us. And when they finished, and by the way, I've got to make the point that when they landed here, he brought his family.
Yeah, they all came.
Oh, no, not all of them.
Well, some came very briefly.
Yeah, one, the man with no name, when he woke up and found this place, he didn't want to stay. One of the issues was he did not want to eat meat. So what he did was he fled, and one of his brothers chased him, and his brother's name was Budabi. He chased him, and he called, come back. He said, no, I'm going away. I'm going back. I'm going back. And he climbed up this tree, and the words are that mingled with the clouds. And when it took off, a cloud of smoke and fire was underneath. And he went up to the Southern Cross, and that is where he lives today. That's not a metaphor. It's a straight out story of a witnessing of one of the families saying, looks around, looks at the place and says, nah, don't want to eat meat, don't like this place, I'm out of here. You other seven can stay, I'm gone. But later on, we know.
You would have been better off coming now because veganism and vegetarianism. So it just was a couple of years too early.
Yeah, a couple of years, maybe about a couple of million years. But what's interesting in Slater's rendition and his papers and stuff is this guy was telling us that our sky heroes created us genetically. In fact, in one of the things he says, he gave us the sacred means of propagation, and he's writing that in the 1930s. Man, we didn't even know about genetics then. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll finish now because I know we've got about 45 minutes. We exceeded that a bit. What we want to do on this is why I think this one's important. We're going to look at this story of aliens from so many different points of view, but not from pictures, not from a disc that's flying in the sky. We're going to go back to what humans said, what our ancestors said. Paul's going to take it from the time where our genetics is dropping and we've been now becoming duller again and becoming more compliant. And he's sifting through all of that and bringing back the original story. We're lucky. We're working on something when we were evolved and we fully understand why we were here. And the word that Slater uses more than anything else is one word only, the soul. Civilization is an embodiment of the soul. And he says now he makes it clear our soul is not civilized anymore. And that's what distinguishes humanity. When our soul is punching away as it should, our genes are turned on and we are evolved beings. Today, yes, we've got flat screen TV, we've got cars, we've got rockets, we've got all these things, but we're not evolved. When the car stops, what do? You ring someone and say, I don't know what that means. When your TV doesn't work, what do? You go buy another one. That's what you do. None of that's intelligent. It's just reflex reactions to something that doesn't require thought. Slater's talking about a time when I can understand why the aliens came to this planet, because they were dealing with people at one stage that were their equals. We had magic, we understood it, and we're aware of it, and we were worthy of working with these beings. We're not now, although that's going to change. So our presentation, we're going to be looking at that, and of course Leah will be doing her normal work in working with an alien that's channeling through her, and I'm going to be asking him questions about what Slater said. I want to find out what he said is correct. I want to find out whether the aliens agree with that. So we're going to be looking at that alien story from 3 different perspectives, and they all link together because we try to create themes each time. And because they're coming back very soon and they're going to help us in the change that's taking place, I think we really need to understand where they're coming from. So basically, that's what that presentation we're doing next up is about, Alfred. And thank you for your patience while we chatted for a while.
Well, that is so fascinating. And so people, you have the links here for this virtual conference, which will be on the 27th of August at 4 p.m. Los Angeles time, at 7 p.m. New York time. Of course, it's on August 28th at 7 a.m. Perth time and 9 a.m. Melbourne time. Our Alien Ancestry with Paul Wallis, the book launch of Echoes of Eden, and Stephen and Evan Strong, and of course, host and speaker Leah Capitelli. And all those links are in the video description and in the article with the video. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you for the opportunity to speak again.
Thank you, Alfred.